In 2023, the Latin American Studies Association, LASA, will organize the main event in Vancouver. And this year, we will host a special presidential session on the work on transitions to democracy published in 1986. So for that, we have today a prominent scholar, very well known and very much appreciated in the Latin American region, who is Philippe Schmitter, for a conversation on this legacy. So what drove you, Guillermo O'Donnell, Lawrence Whitehead, and the whole team to engage in this big project on transitions from the authoritarian rule?
Well, the project began out of the Latin American program of the Woodrow Wilson Center in Washington, which by coincidence, both Guillermo and I were on the board, along with Fernando Enrique, Albert Hirschman, really a very distinguished bunch. And I guess I might be responsible in a sense because I had stopped working on Latin America and was working on Europe, and particularly working on Portugal. And the whole business of transitions began with the 25 de Abril in the Portuguese Revolution. So I was, and of course Spain shortly thereafter, Greece at the same time. So in some sense, the fact that I was living in Italy and going and working on the Southern European transitions was one of the reasons why I was particularly sensitive. The other reason is that I discovered very quickly, after starting to think about this, who was the godfather of the study of transitions. Niccolò Machiavelli. So I was fascinated by Machiavelli, and in a sense, everything Machiavelli wrote is about transitions. So he found himself in a particular context in which he knew that the kind of republic and the kind of polity that Florence was changing. And we were getting, Europe was getting larger states and more autocratic regimes. So by coincidence, I was not only located in this particular area, but inspired especially by Machiavelli. So that's how I think I got involved. And then Guillermo at that time was beginning to transform in Brazil later, but Argentina, Uruguay especially, Chile, no, of course. So yes, but in a sense, as I say, I was particularly sensitive to this issue of transition.
So to somehow this connects to the very past and to what was happening in the times, right?
Yes,
if you think in
exactly.
And the transition.
No, but it has been a standard, but unfortunately not characteristic of contemporary political science, because 90% of American political science and European even is about the persistence of regimes, not their change, if you see what I mean. So that's what made it, I think, a particularly innovative adventure.
Yeah. Very, very good point. Our second question also relates to that, because you are talking about the persistence of regime. And while in the 80s, when you were developing this project, all the focus was on how to promote democracy around the world, and particularly in Southern Europe, Eastern Europe, and Latin America. Now we are facing a period of democratic backsliding, and the question is if you think there are lessons of the transition era to reimagine theory in the 21st century.
Well, there are many different questions in what you just said. So, of course, there are lessons. One of them, of course, is not to exaggerate the backsliding. There is a kind of manipulation of that, which I find, it's partly because I have been, and not just myself, I think Guillermo as well, we're somewhat skeptical about this entire idea of democracy promotion. I don't know if you notice it, but in the book we're very clear that the essential features of a transition are domestic, so to speak, and that there are really only fairly limited and in some cases even perverse qualities to outside promotion of democracy. So in that sense, that was an industry which developed, but not, as I say, I hope not inspired by us. On the contrary, in our writing, we were very focused on the domestic conditions and generally rather skeptical about democracy promotion by outsiders. Now, the book is called Transitions from Authoritarian Rule, not transitions to democracy. Yes. So we have been accused of being too optimistic or whatever. I think that's simply a bad reading of what we wrote. We were not that optimistic, and therefore the notion, I think we calculated, or was it like, yeah, I calculated that if you took all of the attempts to democratize in Latin America from 1900 to roughly 1960s, 70s, only about 1/3 lasted more than 4 or 5 years, if you see what I mean. So generally, transitions fail, okay? So we had that very much in our mind, and I think we were rather pleasantly surprised that much fewer than in the past. And I think I'm still pleasantly surprised. Some of the cases are extraordinarily. Portugal, for example, is an extraordinarily well-functioning democracy. So was Uruguay. So was Chile. So, there are some really remarkable cases. Now, what are the lessons? First, as I say, that the central lesson of everybody, including Machiavelli, he called it fortuna, uncertainty. Okay, the whole core of the thinking about transitions is the uncertainty of the outcome. That's the period. So when things start to become more predictable, the transition is over. Some of these countries have never really gotten out of the transition, so they remain, quote, unpredictable. Nobody really is confident that the rules that are attempted or formally enunciated or passed are actually durable, so to speak. So that's the first thing, is to say that that's part of it, is that transitions, some transitions don't end, others are really quite rapid. Uruguay, for example, perfect model of how you do it. Or even in a very different way, Portugal. So that's part of it then, uncertainty and the prolongation of uncertainty. But remember, the core of a functioning democracy is unlimited uncertainty. Mm-hmm. If there's no uncertainty, it's not a democracy. If the same party keeps winning, it's difficult to imagine a democracy in which there's no real competition, in which somehow live. So, but the point, of course, is the limits to what is uncertain. That is to say, to who will compete and who will win, etc., and how they will win. So that's the core is the role of fortuna in politics, especially the role of fortuna, not about who wins, but how they win and under what rules. Right? That's what you should be focusing on, and that's not so disappointing. Most of these countries, no matter how polarized the parties are or what nasty things people say about each other, etc., complete returns to autocracy are relatively few. Right? There's a lot of very messy, uncertain democracies out there, but complete return to some form of more or less self-proclaimed, fascism, if you want to call it, National Socialism, whatever, autocracy, has been relatively rare. I mean, and even in case of Thailand or something, that's a special case, perhaps, even.
Yeah. Let me go now to Latin America.
Mm-hmm. caveat that it has been a while since I've been thinking about Latin America. I'm sorry to say, yes.
Theoretical question anyway. Is it related to the problem of stateness or state capacity? Do you think this is a precondition for democratization?
Of course. The problem, I guess, well, anyway, yes, of course, you must have three things, right? The first was something that, who discussed this a long time ago? What's his name? He worked on Sweden. But anyway, because first of all, a state is a territory, right? So you have to have some kind of general agreement on what the territory is. So if you have within your territory groups that want to be in a different political system or independent of that system, you live in Barcelona, so you are perhaps familiar with the Catalan movement, etc. Although I must say Spain has managed to sustain a perfectly well-functioning, nobody's perfect, but anyway, a well-functioning democracy under those conditions. But anyway, that's the first condition. So when you talk about state, the first thing you mean is some kind of territorial unit, and it's extremely important that there is at least a general agreement on what the boundaries of that state are. That's the first thing. Secondly, it's a system of, as Max Weber said, of exercise of legitimate coercion authority within that territory. And there, of course, almost no country is perfect. Every country has crimes, political crimes of groups that contest that authority or whatever. So it's a matter then of degree. How strong is that contestation? And this is where the third element comes in, is that at least modern liberal democracy is firmly rooted in the idea of competition between political parties. And that model assumes what I have called a centripetal competition. That is to say, the parties compete for the voters in the middle, so to speak, the so-called median voters. So the competition is, what's taking place, of course, is centrifugal competition in which parties now orient more and more toward mobilizing a core group. That is the main threat. Right? And I have to say, there's not a lot external democracy promotion can do about that. Democracy promotion can improve the status of the judiciary, it can improve the quality of the bureaucracy, etc. But intervening in the party system so that you encourage the party system to compete toward the center rather than to the extremes, that's something which is, essentially domestically produced. Although, obviously, there is a great deal of, and here we come to what I think is the central problem of everything. The one thing that has changed the most since Guillermo and I thought about these things, the technology. And this is the incredibly subversive effect of the internet.
The effects it has in the political
debate. So the internet permits you to mobilize people who don't know each other, except in this very limited way, electronically, so to speak. And we see then this polarization being fed by online communities, etc., which didn't exist in the past. In order to work with somebody else, you needed to know them. You needed to physically, so to speak, be in contact with them, not just simply electronically. So that, I think, is the main problem of contemporary democracy, is the role that is played by this technology, which emerged, as I say, since what we wrote. So that's the most important innovation, if I can put it, affecting the performance of democracy.
Do you think, are there specific dimensions of regime change and transitions related to regions? Does this literature work in silos? And also related to that, because before we were talking about the new literature, the current literature on democratic backsliding, which looks at the topic more globally, if you think this is a good point of view or it hinders more than helping to understand what's going on?
Okay, that's a challenging question, partly because the notion of region is a bit ambiguous. You are obviously referring to regions composed of more than one national state, not subnational regions. And here, of course, Europe is in a category by itself. There are hundreds of regional organizations these days, but none of them have remotely the capacity of the European Union. So in the case of the European Union, there is something like an emerging democracy at the European level. And that's a different matter. Whereas Mercosur or the Central American continent, any of the other ones, none of them really have a governmental capacity, and they certainly don't have functioning competitive party systems and interest groups that are really organized at the regional level. But the most important thing I think that lies behind is this generic notion of diffusion. And there's no doubt that countries that are adjacent to each other are more likely to be influenced by each other's political experiences. So, that's certainly, we see that in Latin America. And of course, in Latin America in particular, there are many institutions and many movements of population, etc., which bring these countries into pretty direct exchange. And they don't exchange a lot of merchants. I mean, most Latin American countries are more dependent on their imports and exports from outside Latin America than from inside. So it's not based on internal exchanges, or rarely is, but on this kind of border and movement of populations and people's just simply knowledge about adjacent countries. And so contagion or diffusion, or whatever you want to call it, then is an important regional feature. And therefore, when one country in a region becomes more democratic, the probabilities that other countries will, and of course, when one country becomes less democratic, it may also, that experience may influence its neighbors. Now, how far does this stretch? And here again, we come to this business of technology. So thanks to the internet, the levels of information, I mean, now you can be Mongolian and know what's going on in Brazil. I mean, that wasn't possible not so long ago. So is a form of communication and identification and perhaps influence that now is, I won't say global, but certainly not just adjacent countries where the diffusion is likely to occur. So it's possible, and I think it's actually happening. That is, in both ways. I mean, you have these remarkable experiences like Spain, for example, which the Spanish influenced a considerable degree, especially something that Guillermo and I discuss rather extensively in the book, which is the notion of a transición pactada, or pacted transition. And obviously there, the Spanish transition was, quote, a model which people got to know about. Footnote. Since you are on Venezuela, Terry insists that this is a result of diffusion because Felipe Gonzalez went into exile in Venezuela and studied the pacted transition of Venezuela, and he took the lesson back to Spain. So it's not Spain to Latin America, it's Latin America to Spain and then back to Latin America. But an example there of diffusion.
There are many interesting avenues from this early work on transitions that now open room for new conversations, because pacted transitions were a model, or were considered a model, for a long time. Now it's in discussion to what extent this legacy, for instance, in the case of Brazil or other cases,
it's possible.
Is bringing problems now.
I hope so.
It also connects second
No, because
question.
before that, when I first started thinking about transitions, having more of a European and a Latin American perspectives, everybody believed that there were really only two kinds of transitions. And they were exemplified by Great Britain, reform, mobilization from below, elites capture this, reform the rules, blah, blah, blah. So, blah, 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 blah. So it's sequential reforms, that's Britain. And then you have the counterexample, France, La Révolution, several of them. So those two countries exemplified the two different passages, reform or revolution. What we emphasized are the other two, new ones in a sense. First there was this pacted transitions, but the other one is, I couldn't find the right English name for it. It was ortogado. Granted, or I can't remember what we ended up using, but where the autocratic regime transforms itself, right? And that was the Brazilian case, for example. Now, you have others as well. Mexican case, you could argue, was where the PRI itself accepted increasingly the competition, etc. And guided the transition. So that's the novelty of the new one. There's two new kinds of transition.
Yeah. Plenty of questions.
End of questions? Okay.
I have many questions, but I have 2-3 more, let's say.
Okay.
Yeah, also related to the rereading or revisiting the work to understand what is going on now.
Yes.
One of the criticisms, which I think is unfair, but anyway I want to know your opinion, is that to somehow was a quite linear view of regime change, which clearly you will claim that is not the case and is a misreading on the opening of the liberalization or opening,
right.
Transition, and then consolidation.
Right.
And I think with the first part maybe it's clear that it's unfair to suggest, because as you said, you were talking about transitions from authoritarian rule and not necessarily to democracy, and this is well
and we never,
in
even if we weren't emphasizing the inevitability of democratization, we also didn't emphasize the fact that there would be necessarily consolidation. So many of these countries simply remained in a transitional state in which the rules were still, so to speak, up for grabs.
And I think this was probably a good point to understand many countries in Latin America.
I think that's part of the problem, so to speak, is that they haven't yet. This is, of course, I love the example the other day of Chile, where they come up with a new constitution, and then they turned it down. Now, but okay. But still, I don't think anybody doubts that Chile is a constitutional democracy. It's it's still living under the constitution octroyée in French. I can't remember. Ortogado. What is ortogado?
Otorgada.
What? Octroyée in French. What?
Otorgada.
Ortogata. Is that Italian or is that
Spanish?
Spanish, okay.
Concessa.
Okay.
In Italian,
Concesso, that's it. Concesso, okay. Good grief. Anyway, I can't think what the English is, but anyway, that's an example, it seems to me, that you have this kind of internal transition, guided by, controlled by the previous autocracy as it opens itself up and allows increasing degrees of competition and even rotation in power.
You said before that democratic promotion is something you don't like much, the idea or the powerful of this, but then you talk about diffusion.
Yeah.
And I think this is quite interesting.
But that's different.
Because, again,
No.
Yeah, that's what
Democracy
I want to...
promotion is deliberate policies followed by country X,
Yeah,
presumably
exactly.
already a democracy, to promote. I
Because
did an empirical study of this, and I discovered that particularly, of course, the comparison becomes the United States versus the European Union. The European Union has been remarkably successful, but it's because you get a prize. you get to join the European Union, whereas you can't join the United States, so to speak. So the U.S. can mess around in your democracy, and it doesn't necessarily produce much of an effect because there isn't any real reward, so to speak. Whereas in the case of Europe, dealing with the former communist countries in Eastern Europe, there was a real, tangible reward. And we see, of course, that this is at the origins of the invasion of the Ukraine, because it's precisely the reward for the Ukraine of joining the European Union is something which is incredibly...
In the case of Europe, it's very clear, but...
it's not. You don't have that. You see, you have...
Yeah, you don't have that, but...
Well, you have something of a role. I must say, the Organization of American States has occasionally played something of a role in... No, okay, I mean, I don't... Well, anyway...
But the question is related to diffusion and context. Because,
right.
For instance, Leonardo Morlino said that one of the 4 quite important factors to expect democratization is a democratic context.
Yeah,
And
I
I
agree
think
with
this
Leonardo.
is
I agree with Leonardo. As I say, there are regional effects, and
Yes.
so clearly, the more states on your border are democratic, the more likely you are going to become, or at least experiment with democracy.
Something
Yes,
which probably played an important
but that's
role in
different
Spain.
than explicit policies, often of non-adjacent states, to try to intervene and say, we'll promote this party, or we'll promote this kind of a party system, or this kind of legislature, or this kind of voting system, whatever. I think that has very limited potentiality, and in some cases even can be perverse.
Venezuela. My last question. In your opinion, what are the 1 or 2 big research questions that scholars of democratization will be forced to address in the next decade?
Well, I've already mentioned the one, and that's the impact of this changing technology. There's no question that is the big challenge even for very well-established democracies. And I think the United States is a very clear example of how this new technology is undermining the party system, polarizing, creating all sorts of strange and wonderful groups that only contact each other online or can appear spontaneously in some square but never have any kind of permanent structure, don't have any kind of program for reform or for change or whatever. They just meet and demonstrate and then disappear again into the woodwork and come back again, right? So that's clearly the main thing, is what is technology doing? This particular kind of technology doing to democracy? I think another one of the most important, a lot of the, let's call it I don't like the word backsliding, but call it blacksliding, has to do with party systems. Parties are not what they used to be. So trying to recreate a viable party system in which people actually believe in an ideology, because what keeps a party system going is some kind of confidence in a particular group which has a vision of the future. Whether that future is a reproduction of the past is another matter, but still, it has a plausible image, let's say, of the future. Call that an ideology. And it isn't working. So what do you do? I mean, one of the countries which I've studied the most, as I mentioned, is Portugal. Portugal is an exception. Thanks to its revolution, which I participated in and very much approved of, nevertheless, thanks to the revolution, they have a real party system. People believe in political parties, and the political parties compete centripetally and rotate each other in power and respect each other, and they have a reasonable vision, especially, of course, in the case of Portugal. That vision was very closely associated with the idea of joining European integration, that is, joining the EU, but also other. So there are a few examples like that, most of the Scandinavian countries, although it's beginning to come apart. Switzerland, you know very well, it has one of the most firmly established party systems in the history of the world, right? So there are countries where political parties have sustained their memberships and passed it from one generation to another. That is, however, the core. How do you pass political identification from one generation to another? One of my favorite empirical examples is here in Italy. Surveys in Italy in the 1970s showed that something like 80%, almost 80 or slightly even low 80% of children or before 18 knew what political party their parents were voting for. This has now fallen to something like 20 in the 20s. So that's an amazing thing. Now it's partly because their parties, the parents have probably voted for two different parties in successive elections, so they can't pass it on. But still, that intergenerational transmission of confidence in a particular.
You mentioned two dimensions of the problem. One is identity or rootness of the parties.
Yes.
And the other is the competition.
Well,
Centripetal,
exactly.
centrifugal.
Right.
And could we also talk about how parties work?
Well, as I say, I think how parties work is a combination of those two things. That is, how do you compete, and then how do you pass on this identification from one generation to another? Both of those are breaking down, so to speak. So parties are at the core of the dilemma of contemporary democracy. And that's, as I say, almost true everywhere, with these few exceptions like Portugal, or even Spain, for example, still has a party system, right?
In Latin America, we also, I think, have some.
Well, Uruguay,
Argentina,
and I think Chile. I think Chile's do. Yeah, well, okay, but Uruguay for sure, and Costa Rica, I think, has a pretty.
And also Argentina, I would say.
Argentina is such a mess. I mean, I have to confess that Argentina is. No. It's embarrassing to admit this, but I spent a year studying Argentina. I interviewed I don't know how many people, and I never understood the country. So Argentina is my great failure. I just simply could not understand how a country with so many well-educated, intelligent people, without any major linguistic or any of the other cleavages that tore other countries apart. So here's this very, when you think about it, homogeneous country, linguistic, even religiously, although a few, but still not. It had every asset that is supposed to produce a stable democracy, and it didn't. And okay, but I say, so Argentina is my great professional embarrassment. I admit I have never written a word on Argentina because I just simply did not understand the country, period.
My very last question, I promise.
Okay,
but
well.
If you read Argentina's democracy from 83 till now, has been a stable democracy with an economical mess.
It's a mess economically. That is, of course, part of the problem. Guillermo had a theory of this. Two theories. Guillermo had one, and Torquato had another. Guillermo's theory was the basic problem of Argentina was the exchange rate, and the reason why the exchange rate was so important was that one of the most important domestic consumption commodities, meat, was also an export item. And so that was a kind of fatal flaw in the relationship between exports and domestic consumption, which Argentina. Torquato had a different theory. And I think, well, anyway, Torquato's theory was that Argentina doesn't work because it doesn't have a really well-functioning conservative party. That it's actually a very conservative country without a conservative party.
Which now Argentina has.
Okay, I hope so. I'm not following Argentine politics, so that much.
I
But
will reflect on it.
okay, but as I say, maybe now I could understand Argentina, but I don't think I couldn't then. I really, when you look at it, every single objective factor, which on a global, multivariate analysis produced stable democracy, Argentina had it. It didn't, okay? So what can I say? Of course, most people blame it on Peronismo.